Hello and welcome to the Little Knowledge podcast with me, Paul Busby, and with Goff Morgan. And this time round, it's part 2 of Tredegar House, and there will be curses, there will be attempted murder, there will be all kinds of stuff. We're supposed to cover the 17th and 18th century of this ongoing Morgan saga. And who better to talk about the Morgans than Mr. Morgan? How are you, Goff?
I'm fine. Greetings to you, everybody. Hope you're all doing well.
I
Yes?
never know when to pause to allow you to get your hello in.
I just slightly when I feel like it. You know, I can roll with it. It's improv, darling, improv.
You know, when we got started and it started recording, when I said welcome to, I very nearly said welcome to Tredegar House. I said for years as a tour guide. My most famous moment, of course, is nothing to do with quality tours. I did once say, after doing many tours in one day and everything was just, on autopilot, I did indeed start a tour by saying, welcome to Tredegar House, the home of the Morgan family for 5 million years. Not even a Welsh bard would come to that, would they? Not my greatest moment.
I saw that moment, and what was lovely, there were people sitting in the room and they just saying, oh.
No one listens.
Yeah, the first Morgan was a blob of primordial goo.
Blob at blob.
Blob at blob.
Now, do you remember where we left? We left here. On part 1. Oh, part 1's available, of course, on this channel. We started with part 1, which was Origins. Rather than follow the normal Cadavor the Great, the Lord Rhys Bledry and all of that, we went from we had both, didn't we? We had the most imaginative, which was the second son of Noah.
Yep.
And the most conservative, which was descent from the native lords of Killian, Sir Morgan ap Meredith, didn't we?
Morgan ap Meredith, yes.
Yeah. And how did we end it, Goff? Where did we leave the Morgans?
Do you know, I can't quite remember. The trouble is when you know so much of all this, you can't think, where did we stop? We stopped with the just after the Civil War.
Well done, that man. Yeah, we did. We stopped just after at least you're listening, Goff.
Yeah.
Not like my tours.
I thought we got just to the end of the Civil War, but I thought, well, did we go slightly? I knew we didn't go into the building of the brick house, which is where we are now.
Exactly. Now, here we are. This was the image we ended with a little sneak peek of what happens afterwards. Yeah, the Civil War, where the Morgans kind of got away with it, didn't they, by being very, very old.
Yeah. Yes.
And being very, very Protestant, really.
Too old to execute.
Yeah.
And and being that sort of strange groups of families which were what they call moderate royalists. They were Protestant families who supported the rights of king over parliament. So they sort of sat somewhere in the middle of what was the sectarian divide as well. So,
or you could do, I mean, old Sir William's son Thomas, who takes over, is called by one historian as a neutralist, because he's the one that went over to Parliament and was arrested as a hinderer.
Oh,
so right. They got through it somehow. They've threaded the eye of the needle.
A lot of families had to do this. A lot of coats were turned at various times during that conflict, because that's the only way to get out the other side of it, I think.
And the Morgans had lost a fair few rebellions over the years, been on the wrong side. They'd learned a trick or two, hadn't they?
Yes, quite.
Anyway, we do have this. Speaking of that old house, this is a sketch, a tracing made by Octavius Morgan on an old map now lost. How many documents did Octavius have which are now lost? You know, he had far more material than we do.
Yeah.
But it shows the old house here.
Yeah.
And this is just before, Octavius reckons it's just before the rebuild. So where these days, if you know Tredegar House, you'd find the Cedar Garden, you have the Great Walk.
Yes.
And up in this direction, you have a maze, a wilderness.
So that's where the orangery is, and the stable block.
We have the middle court, we have the Great Bowling Green in front of that, and the Great Gates.
So the Great Bowling Green is now where the 17th century stable courtyard
is. The stable courtyard. And you have orchards, which you see. Now, orchard has changed the meaning, I think. Orchard, at one time, orchard did mean an enclosed garden, which is why in certain places you have to define it, such as an apple orchard, pear orchard. Originally, an orchard was an enclosed space. Nevertheless, it's still an orchard garden. And here we have where the brewhouse tea rooms now are. They are open and available for you to visit.
Yes.
Stables.
Oh.
Now, there is a problem with this. Octavius, of course, can't be sure what this old map was. Did it really show Tredegar before the red brick, or did it show a proposal of what they could do with the gardens? I mean, we simply do not know.
No. Yeah,
But,
you're right. There's no idea. Yeah, if it was a gardening plan which never came to fruition, it becomes conjectural then, doesn't it?
but we can at least say that it might get the old house fairly right.
Yes.
If we ignore the gardens themselves.
Oh, I've just noticed something quite interesting there.
What's that?
You see the little gate. You got the inner court, and then there's obviously a entranceway through into the great walkabout garden.
Yeah.
More or less where that is today, there is still a doorway. What would be a doorway entrance in the same?
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating?
You're quite right. Yeah. So anyway, we're not entirely sure. We do know that when they decided, William Morgan, to knock down the old Tudor house and rebuild, he did keep one bit of this old house. Stables seem far longer than the brew house, don't they? We don't even know if this is to scale.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a tease more than anything else.
Fascinating, though, isn't it? See what is fascinating.
So he knocks down most of the stone house in 1664 or thereabouts, and he builds in glorious red brick. Red brick being a very rare building material, a lot of stone in Wales. And so it's a statement more than anything else, isn't it?
Yeah. Essentially, it's built right across the front of the old building.
Yeah, the empty bit.
Where we had that empty courtyard in the middle, that was it. And it's built more or less across the front of that, and it closes off what was a U-shaped building to make an interior courtyard and a building on four sides. So exactly. So the whole impressive entrance of the house becomes this red brick house.
That's right. This is the new principal facade. The bricks were almost certainly made on site. There are maps which just north of the River Ebu, there is a spot called the Rock. And we do know in the early 1700s, there was a brick kiln on site near where the old forge was. And so the bricks are made on site. There's plenty of clay. Octavius Morgan in the 19th century went back to that spot and reckoned there was more clay for more bricks if needed.
Well, Newport's built on clay, massive clay deposits around Newport. I mean, yeah, my garden's clay. Most people's gardens are clay in certain parts of Newport, yeah.
Yeah. Now we
also the bricks are a slightly odd size as well, aren't they? They're not quite a standard size. That's why they also know they were locally made.
The bond is also different. The house is an English bond, but the stables, which is apparently contemporary, is a Flemish bond, completely different. So anyway, we'll get to that and why that might be. We might do this in an architectural dig around podcast on Tredegar House we're talking about.
Oh, really? If you just want to talk about the house, that's a whole episode on its own. So we might do a little bonus for you of that one. Well, hey!
But there is one thing. We're looking down, and so these are the gardens that you saw. Now, this is extremely clear. They've built 2 red brick wings, all very nice. Yeah. In the 17th century, these stables would have been here or thereabouts, you saw on the old map, if it was accurate. The kitchen wing in the 17th century would have been a single-story building with a massive gap here, an entranceway to get grain carts in. There would have been a cupola on top of the roof in the 17th century for light and air, but you can see this is an unfinished project. We'd always thought this, because you can see this wing, it seems nice and finished, but here, this bit juts out, and then you've just got this space and what's left of the old Tudor.
Yeah, it ends with a bang, doesn't it? You can tell they were heading up that way.
They were heading up that way, and in fact, when the National Trust put this new shiny roof on a few years ago, when they dug around and re-rendered this gable end, the unfinished bit, you would suggest, it was timber framed. The fact that this gable is timber framed is indicative that they had not finished building. Yeah. So the question is, Goff, what do you reckon? Did they run out of money, or did they get sentimental at the last minute and want to keep a bit of the old house?
Oh, money. Money. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you don't build a house like that as a statement to show that you've arrived and just go, oh, no, let's leave the old hall. Isn't it nice? No, they were heading that way, and it would have gone. Eventually, they probably would have taken the kitchen unit into as well, and you had a complete square. So they ran out of cash.
The other reason why you're probably right on this is you've got your formal gardens, which in most houses you want to show off. And there's only 2 rooms you can see the formal garden, or 3 if you count the attics. There's only 3 rooms you can actually see the formal gardens from.
Yes, quite. Oh, yes, quite.
So
Yes,
there should have been another red brick wing where you could
Yeah.
show off your gardens.
Yeah.
So it's very unusual. It's
Yeah.
unfinished, isn't it? It's unfinished.
Yeah, it's unfinished. I don't think there's much argument on that.
Not anymore. No, I don't think there is. So it is an old shop, this, isn't it? Look at that. They've still got the flagpole and they've
Oh,
got
yeah.
the dodgy, leaky roof.
Of course. I never realized how different the roof was until I see it now. Good
Yeah.
Lord, yeah.
Well, it weathered a bit.
Yeah. I didn't see it looking that bad when we were up there as young men.
Yeah, well, we were often
along the top of the leads, dear me.
Well, you know what they say. We were inside looking out, weren't we?
Oh, yeah.
Quite often. But what we have here, again, unusual. What is unusual is the barley twist columns by the door.
Yeah.
That's quite unusual, certainly in British houses. And you've got these swags of fruit underneath the first floor windows. This is all rather Dutch.
Yes. Dutch influence. Oh.
Why shouldn't you use Dutch influence? During their golden age, the Netherlands was certainly the place to copy from. This started life, believe it or not, as a town hall.
Oh,
Now a royal palace.
Oh,
it is, of course, and how's that for a cupola?
Yeah.
You've got the Amsterdam Town Hall, and underneath
that's interesting.
the windows,
The swags, yeah.
of fruit.
Oh, so that's very intriguing.
You don't often get swags of fruit under first floor windows. They're Bath stone in Tredegar's case.
You've got almost like a little mini Amsterdam town hall with a house, haven't you, really?
In a way, but there's also
because you have the cupola in the middle as well. You've got the two slightly fatter end pieces. You've got the, you've got interesting. You can tell where the influence is really clear there.
And there are other buildings in The Hague where clearly the influence, no cupola involved, but you can actually see this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and it's an art museum now.
Yeah.
But here the swags.
Yeah, the swags, yeah.
Under first floor windows. The Dutch touch even enters inside the house. And how different is this from the Tudor building, which would have looked very baronial and wooden paneling and slightly dark? And wow.
Oh,
he produces
incredible, isn't it?
The gilt room, which although we always say, and again, you've got the barley twist columns here, you've got old Sir William above the fireplace in those days. That's, we talked about him. Do watch part 1 if you haven't yet. It'll make a lot more sense if you watch all the parts of this. And the paintings on the walls, they actually come from engravings made in Amsterdam between 1665 and 1668.
Yeah. I thought some of them were statues actually on Amsterdam Town Hall.
That's right.
Told at one point.
Absolutely right. And here, even this little bit here, it's got WM, and that this is from inside Amsterdam Town Hall.
Oh, blimey.
So this is an Italian and Dutch room.
Yeah.
They had a stable block, almost as grand as the house. Certainly the way into the stable is more sophisticated in many ways than the way into the house.
Yeah.
The fact that this is Flemish bond rather than English bond, even though the dendrochronology of the wood suggests this is contemporary to the house, the 1670s, I've got a debate about this, which will wait until our architectural podcast.
Okay.
The first image of William Morgan's new house is this. It's 1684.
Oh,
it is an event that we have touched on in the past. When he wound up at Rupera, he wound up at Margam. He wouldn't turn up at Tredegar House because the Morgans hated him. The Duke of Beaufort's Progress of 1684.
Oh.
Chap called Dinley or Dinley made the sketch, but it might not be entirely accurate because they didn't stay at Tredegar House on the Progress. So I think they whizzed past and Dinley had a quick look.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, gave an impression.
Because there are things which are true. It's enclosed. You've got gates. There's no sign of a stable block in 1684, but it could be here-ish. He's got the cupola.
Yeah.
It looks about right, except he's put windows on the inside of the pavilions, which were never there. So it is not accurate, really. He had a quick look out the window and had a sketch when he got home, I reckon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nevertheless, this is our first image.
Well, it's quite interesting. Ah, the man himself who built it.
Absolutely. William Morgan. He was on the list. I should say William Morgan. So many places call him Sir William Morgan, but he never had a knighthood, you know.
Oh, that's intriguing.
Never had a knighthood. Oh. This is plain old Mr. William Morgan. He was on the short list for a knighthood.
Yeah.
An order which was never created in the end for political reasons, the Knights of the Royal Oak, named after the Royal Oak that Charles II hid in
Yeah.
after the Battle of Worcester, hiding from the victorious parliamentarian army.
Hmm.
He was going to set it up to reward those families who'd given special service to the Stuart crown.
Hmm.
You know, the Morgans were slightly dodgy. It must be remembered that William's uncle, Sir Anthony Morgan, lost everything for his royalism. His own father cut him out of the will.
Yeah.
So whatever, he was on the list, and in the end they thought, now, do we really want to dig up old ghosts here? Let's just let it lie. And they never did the Royal Oak knighthood order, so he never got a knighthood.
Oh, that's not interesting. But doesn't the just before we move away from the this part altogether, when he built this house and he filled it with all these references to Amsterdam, Town Hall, and Dutch images, isn't that because he spent a lot of time in the exiled court of Charles II during the?
It could well be. There is every indication that he knew Charles II, and we will certainly come to evidence of that. Yeah, I think it was possibly that he had supported. Again, it's the Morgans maybe hedging their bets, you know.
Yeah. Well, this is the Morgans coming back after the Civil War, isn't it? This is them saying, we have now arrived. And what they're saying, we are the king's men. We are back in favour. We were the royalists. The monarchy has been restored. We know the current monarch, Charles II. We know that they are stating in a very big, bold way, we're back on top again because our influence has now been revived. And I think that's what an awful lot of this new building and statement is about.
Yeah. But you need cash, of course, for the new building, even if you don't finish it. And he got a fair wodge of cash and set up the Morgans to dominate Breconshire for centuries by marrying this lady in 1661.
Oh.
This is Blanche Morgan.
Blanche.
Now, Blanche was possibly, there is a lady I know who would say, quite frankly, that she did not deserve a penny of her money because her father, Judge Morgan of Theroux, was already married when he married Blanche's mother. By the way, this is William's first cousin. Blanche's mother was Elizabeth Morgan of Tredegar.
Oh, right.
Slightly icky, but, you know, that was the style of the time.
So he's married a very rich first cousin who may not necessarily be the right side of the blanket.
Well, this is the problem. I mean, the marriage to Elizabeth Morgan of Tredegar was fine, but not if he's already married. And this is what
that's it. It would be an illegitimate
legally
marriage.
It would be illegal. He would have been a bigamist. Yeah. And that is what Sybil Waite from London claimed, that Judge Morgan, Blanche's father, had married her. In the end, she pinned him down where he admitted that she was his wench. They lived in the same house and had a daughter. But Judge Morgan denied that he'd ever actually married her. And poor old Sybil never could come up with the marriage certificate or proof that they actually married. She was well funded. She came back 2 bites at the cherry. So Judge Morgan thought she must have been funded by some prominent figure that wanted to take him down.
Oh, how interesting.
So I mean, there's whole lot going on we don't have time for here. Yeah. But there's a lot. So it's not as easy as Blanche coming in with cash and everything's rosy.
Yeah.
She might not have been legally entitled.
Yeah.
To that cash if the dad was a bigamist.
Not quite.
And so it's always a complicated thing with the Morgans, isn't it, really? Blanche dies in 1673, so she doesn't live long enough to see their new house. They probably lived at Theroux, a house in Breconshire she brought into the family. Yeah. And she brought so much land from Breconshire that Judge Morgan had created this empire that it did. Because of Blanche, the Morgans ended up dominating Breconshire for the next several centuries.
Oh, right.
So politically, it was very important.
Yeah. Yeah.
And here he is. Like you said, Goff, a moderate man in many ways. Moderate man in politics. He actually says moderation is his aim. Doesn't say it about alcohol, though.
Doesn't he?
No. He is forever having a fever when he's needed to have a vote in the House of Commons. They're all MPs from here on in, let's just say that. And in fact, we do know that in the summer of 1677, drinking the health of Sir Joseph Williamson, the Secretary of State at Tredegar, with Sir Edward Mansell of Margam, cost him at least 6 bottles from his cellar and laid him up extreme ill of a violent fever.
Yeah, only because he'd been fevered as a newt the night before.
Fevered as a newt. Yeah, I'm sure that's what the MP said as well.
Oh, bless her.
Now, he married again, and a good catch, ostensibly a good catch. 1675, we have Lady Elizabeth de Rell. Now, she was from the Lewis family of the Van Mansion in Caerphilly. She brought a little bit of money with her, but she brought a fair bit of Glamorgan as well, more lands to boost the Tredegar coffers. She was a very wealthy widow, very young lady. You think of widows as older ladies, but she's still in her 20s here.
Yeah.
And she marries William Morgan. Elizabeth has an awful lot of loss. First husband, Sir Francis de Rell, dies of smallpox. The evidence is they seem very close. She lost a daughter. She had a 1-year-old daughter, Maria, who moved with her into Tredegar. Maria died in 1676 at the age of 1.
Oh, bless. Her
brother died. She has an awful lot of grief. And maybe, I mean, this is a very sensitive issue. We're dealing with mental health here, whether it be 1677 or, this year. It's still a delicate issue. I think the best way to do it, though, is to go back to the original primary sources.
Yeah.
And to explain what happened. We certainly can't diagnose. Or, at this distance, we're not qualified. Maybe someone watching this podcast has a far better idea than us of what actually happened. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through what happened that's in 1677. Okay? So it's just the facts, ma'am, as they used to say in what film? Dragnet. Just the facts. I think that was Dragnet.
Another one for the teenagers?
No, another one for the teenagers. Well, it starts off, we know that summer and that autumn, she is much discontented and unquiet, watching. That wonderful term again, watching. It's 17th and 18th century parlance for sleeplessness. She's up at night watching.
Oh,
several days and nights together, that she abused her husband several times, turned several servants away without cause, and was displeased with her husband and used ill language to him because he would not beat the servants before they went. They got through 20 servants.
Blimey.
So she wasn't happy. 23rd of October, she says she'd go to London, saying she had important business. She didn't go to London. She went to Thomas Bassett's house in Newport, which appears to have been an inn or a tavern in Newport at that time. Mr. Thomas Bassett's. Returned next morning. So no explanation of why. 4 days later, 27th of October, she rode to Sir Trevor Williams' home at Llangibby. Returned at 8 p.m. in a very discontented manner. She's had no sleep now for goodness knows how long. At 12 or 1 o'clock that night, she went into her husband's chamber, where he was asleep, and opened the curtains in a great rage and passion, and called 2 of the maidservants with her to see how like a monkey her husband looked. She fell violently upon him in the bed, striking his face and head. He woke up and asked what ailed her. She made at him violently again and declared she would either kill or be killed, that she was ready to do it, and that she would damn herself or be revenged on him. Well, interesting phrase. They put her out of the room twice, and twice she came back in. She ran at him, struck him, tore his shirt. She broke a looking glass. She tried to break a cabinet. She asked for scissors at this point to cut her hair, which of course were denied her. Then she wanted to burn her hair with a candle and then possibly in the fireplace. That was stopped. She then ran into a servant's chamber looking for scissors. And the episode ends there. 5 days later, 1st of November, Bedwellty. They're staying there. Both are in bed, where she told her husband quite calmly that she would brain him. Then she ran next door, out of bed, where 2 servants were, and told the servants that she'd quarrelled with her husband and she would brain him. She stayed that night with the servants and returned to bed the next morning of her own volition. 4 days after that again, the 5th of November, 1677. She's in the new hall at Tredegar House. She abuses a guest, calling him a fool and a knave in a passionate manner, and she had a staff ready to strike him. William asked why, he's done nothing to you. She continued answering her husband in a passionate manner, left the hall, and paced for half an hour. She then followed her husband, staring at him all the way. Trying to make peace, everyone asked her to join the family for prayers in the new hall. She refused. She paced twice up and down the room. Then she ran at her husband, stared in his face, and said she would haunt him like Banquo's ghost, and she would not suffer him to rest, day or night. They all went into supper. She went with them. She stood in her normal place rather than sitting staring at her husband all the way. That night, she entered his chamber again, ran at him in a furious manner, tore his clothes and cravat, calling him a base rogue, and then ran at him with a sword. He managed to stop the blade and forced it from her. She then ran away, aiming to go to London. 7th of November, she writes to her husband thanking him for the gift of a chariot, a small thing compared to all his other generosities. She says one day people will know about the forces that have separated them. And then in a PS, she says that if he wants, he can burn their marriage settlement with his own hands. At this point, he's worried about what she's going to do in London. He writes to Williamson, the Secretary of State, and he writes, "I hope this will find you at ease from my troublesome wife. I would give anything I had kept her at home, for nothing troubles me more than she should be so troublesome to you and other good friends, as I hear she has been." I've seen this quoted before, but then they don't quote the next bit.
Yeah.
"I fear 'tis not in her power to help it, and therefore I pity her with all my heart, and shall endeavour as much as in me lies for her recovery and doing well."
Yes, that's puts a different complexion on it, doesn't it?
It does
A lot of
rather.
the suggestion has been that she was sort of, terrible inconvenience and embarrassment, whereas he's not. He's obviously genuinely.
And remember, this isn't him changing the documents. This is letters he sent to someone else.
Yeah.
20th of November, he writes again to Williamson that the devil has so possessed her that she declared she would damn herself, but she would defame me. And she care not what she says, nor to whom she says it. So I beg you, in case she comes to the king, to let him know that nothing she says is true, but if needs must, the world shall see her actions. He does know Charles II.
Yeah.
He's worried about what Elizabeth's going to say to the king.
Yeah.
Williamson talks to the king, and the king basically says, "I understand."
Yeah.
But he's right to write this on the 20th of November, because unbeknownst to him, the night before in London, she has very sadly had another episode.
Yeah.
And it could potentially have been the most violent one yet. She burst into the house of Mr. Hopgood. Now, he's a merchant, and he lived in the same building as her brother-in-law, John Morgan the merchant, in Loughbury, and challenged her husband's brother, John Morgan, to meet with her at Southampton Fields at 3 o'clock the next day to fight with her there. 6 a.m. the next morning, she turns up at the house with 2 servants with naked swords. This is serious now. She has armed men with her. After much knocking, a servant lets her in. They burst into the house and demand to know if John Morgan were there. The servant says, "Well, he's in bed." Elizabeth says, "I have him sure and will kill him." She ran up the stairs with the men, straight past his room, luckily, because she thought his bedroom was higher up. John came out of his room lower down and inquired what was wrong, and then these armed men and her, back down the stairs to confront him. Thinking quickly, John Morgan the merchant gets into a room below the stairs and bars himself in. For some time they endeavoured to force the door. Failing, they broke all the windows they could come at. At this, poor old Mr. Hapgood, who is having a room in the garret at the top of the house, is woken up by the smashing of his windows, arrives and demands to know what has happened. She immediately heads upstairs with the armed men to get him. For he tries to save himself by closing the door, but she forces it, and the men force it. But then she stops when she sees him, and she says, "You are not the person I looked for." And they went back downstairs and fell to battering the windows again, and then departed. There's also an incident where Mrs. Hopgood, she found Mrs. Hopgood and stabbed her with a sword. She was only saved by her whalebone stays.
Oh, good grief.
So no harm was actually done with all of this. It should be said. But William again writes to... now, this is we have a letter here of what on earth you do next. Here's the letter. It's at Aberystwyth. It's from William Morgan. And he writes to John Morgan the merchant, his brother. He says, "Sorry to hear from many hands of my wife's very bad distempers. I would not be wanting in anything that might be done to contribute to her recovery." But he makes this very important point. He asks his brother to take the advice of the physicians and advises that before anything is put into execution, that his brother consults with and has the approval of her own relations.
Oh.
So whichever way you want to spin this, William Morgan is not kicking his wife into an asylum to get rid of her.
Get rid of an embarrassment, no.
No, I mean, he's clearly trying to do what is the best thing in this circumstance. So the 5th of December, they write to the Lord Chief Justice, Richard Rainsford, about the several great extravagances on account of her distempers. And the decision comes down that confinement and the use of physic would help, and that Dr. Thomas Allen is a fit man to use in this case. Therefore, for the prevention of the breach of His Majesty's peace, they require them, with the assistance of friends and relations, to take Dame Elizabeth Dayrell into custody, sadly, and carry her to the said Dr. Thomas Allen, and to leave her in his care and custody. Dr. Thomas Allen was a visiting physician at this hospital, Bedlam, better known as Bedlam.
Bedlam.
But also he had a private, it was called this, a private madhouse in Finsbury. And this, we think, is where Elizabeth went into. Interestingly, there is a man who was there in 1688. Whether he was there at the same time as Elizabeth at the Finsbury madhouse, we don't know. But his name was James Carkees, and he wrote poems from within the Finsbury Hospital and Bedlam.
Oh, yeah, written at Finsbury and Bedlam, yeah.
Dr. Thomas Allen was his patient, and this is the first poetry in English to be published while written from inside a mental institution.
Oh, fascinating. Oh.
So it is 1679. And this is interesting in Latin. It says, you know, we all make fools of ourselves.
Oh, gosh.
But it's interesting what he says in here, if I've got a chance to, just a tiny bit of the poetry inside, because he gives us an idea of what possibly Elizabeth Dayrell would have experienced as far as diet, because diet was big for Thomas Allen. He writes, his diet was most of it milk, to reduce him again to a child, and butter as soft as silk, to smooth the fierce and the wild.
Interesting.
So whether Elizabeth had that same thing, we're not entirely sure. I have to say, although, that clearly James Carkees did not like Dr. Thomas Allen, and he writes a poem against him here. You know, he was captive, you know. By the standards of the day, Dr. Thomas Allen was forward-thinking, and I think the best doctor they could have had. For instance, pressure was put on Allen to have blood transfusions for patients at his asylums as experiments using animal blood.
Oh, good grief.
And Dr. Thomas Allen stopped all that.
Yeah.
So there we are. Now, yeah, I mean, it's all very sad. What we do know, however, is that Elizabeth Dayrell did come out of her confinement. She outlived her husband. She married again, a man from Cumbria called Robert Carleton, and she had 2 more children. She was always having legal battles against the Morgans, and she died in 1694 at the age of 40.
Oh, gosh. Which for the age wasn't particularly bad, quite a good age for the Devon period as well, which is bizarre. I mean, it's nice to know. Nice to know that she did recover, because I think a lot of people just didn't, because the treatment was so, you know, haphazard in a way. They were just trying to find their way around it. Yeah, Allen's methods seemed to be mostly about sort of that calming and soothing and trying to keep everybody sort of on an emotional level, wasn't it? You know,
Carkees was right about one thing though, because Allen's method also thought that if he put him in a room with the rats, the fear of the rats would gnaw away the insanity.
What?
In a ratish way. So, you know, it's all relative, isn't it? It's so there was still a little bit of odd, as it would be. It's 1677, you know.
Oh, yeah, it was quackery was the norm for medicine at that point.
William Morgan also died at the age of 40. He died in 1680 of a fever. Died suddenly at the age of 40 of a fever. And in his will, he made sure that he did indeed leave to his wife, Elizabeth Dayrell. He left her £300 and the best of all my coaches, 6 of my best coach horses, 3 nags, and £100 yearly from the land that she'd brought into the Morgan family. In fact, we also know that after his death, the Morgans had to pay Elizabeth Dayrell, according to William's son, £1,500 a year the rest of her life.
That's a very, very good income for 1680.
It certainly is. But isn't the best news of all, of course, is that Elizabeth, who had so much power as a powerful, rich widow, you know, it's just how sad her life ended up. Yeah. Again, we can't diagnose, but just the facts.
No. Interesting, isn't it?
Now, this baby...
ugly baby.
It's William's son. He had plenty of sons and only one daughter, Blanche. So he did this big thing with the Mansells of Margam, this kind of marriage deal, whereby his eldest son Thomas, who you see here, would marry Martha Mansell, Sir Edward's daughter, and Sir Edward's eldest son would marry Blanche, William Morgan's daughter. And he had a big marriage portion for Blanche, and sadly, though, Blanche died at the age of 13. He's buried in Stepney. So, so the only daughter of William and the original Blanche didn't make it, but Thomas did make it and did marry Martha Mansell of Margam. And here he is. For years, this was said that this was William, his dad.
Yeah.
With Elizabeth Wyndham, his mum. It's actually Elizabeth Wyndham, grandmother of Thomas, because the date is 1665.
Oh, right.
Thomas was born in 1664.
Yeah. Oh, so it's his grandmother, not the mother.
Grandmother.
Oh.
Thomas is look, portraitures of babies. I fell down a rabbit hole. And I came across an article which basically says, why do all medieval babies in portraits look like ugly old men?
As I said, yes, true. The ugly baby, ugly.
I could go into the theory of the homunculus and why it's based on Jesus, but we have no time.
No. But well, they did have a concept of childhood in the way we have it. We have a very, very structured idea of childhood and progression and various stages of it. They didn't. They were just little people.
Yeah, literally. Well, the little man is what homunculus means.
Yeah, they painted you as little people. Yeah.
Well, little Thomas, who
I like the little coral chew, that little red thing he's got there, is what you would chew on when you were teething.
Yeah, chewing on that.
But it's gold. It's gold with a piece of coral, you know.
Well, they are the Morgans of Tredegar. There are standards.
And of course, there's all sort of coded things going on in there, like why is she holding those two roses in that particular ostentatious manner? We'd have no idea what that will be about.
Someone in the chat will know.
Somebody can tell us.
Someone will tell us what that particular flower means.
Yeah.
Thomas, good fun, Thomas. In many ways, he does marry Martha, but I can only ever see him as a baby now.
Yeah, yeah.
So little Thomas does marry Martha very young. In fact, until 1684, certain parts of the church wouldn't recognize it because she was 12 and he was 16.
Oh, blimey.
When they married. So what Thomas decided to do was basically get out of Dodge. He decides to go to the continent. And as he writes to his uncle, John Morgan the merchant, who appears to be at home sort of, running the shop because he hasn't come of age yet, he needs to enjoy his inheritance. So he goes to Europe to enjoy it. Leaving poor Martha at home.
Yeah, dear me.
And start spending money like water, but it'll be absolutely fine. As long as he doesn't get into bad company, and that's the problem. He immediately gets into bad company. This is Lord Elland, Henry Savile, known as a dissolute man who drank himself to death.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard of him, and I can't find the context how.
I don't know how anyone called Savile could be an evil man. But anyway, Savile, Lord Elland, was a particularly a bad example, really. And soon he is losing money he does not have. Yeah. I'm good at gambling. Well, no, you're not really, are you? Because you're losing an absolute fortune. I mean, for instance, he writes back cheerfully that they went to Fontainebleau and fallen into play. Thomas and Lord Elland lost 500 pistols, which in today's terms is about £40,000 in one game.
Oh, great.
He soon lost so much money that his credit was refused, and they thought that if he had to get out of Paris because he was in danger of being imprisoned. He's writing these panicky letters home for more money. Clearly, John the merchant has given him lots of money and asked him to come home. He'd take the money and just carry on gambling. This is a naughty baby. Now, at this point, I put the information we know about Thomas. As you know, Goff, this podcast is cutting-edge stuff.
Oh, quite.
One day we might even have an intro.
Indeed. Oh, good Lord.
So I decided to use an AI image generator.
What?
To produce an image. I typed in what I wanted, 18th century aristocrat, an image of Thomas Morgan gambling, because we don't have any portraits of him apart from him as a baby. Unfortunately, I left the baby bit in without realizing it.
Yeah.
And the image I produced, and it came up with this monstrosity. This is Thomas Morgan gambling.
Isn't that wonderful?
I do apologize.
The dissolute baby was Thomas Morgan.
It gets worse.
He's even got a sort of boozer's face, isn't he?
I tried to soften it. Are you ready for real horror?
Oh, no.
I tried to soften it by saying, well, make him at least smile.
Yeah.
And then it all went wrong. Because what came back was this.
Oh!
Thomas Morgan, ladies and gentlemen. Dear me, let's get off it. It's horrendous. Canton bleu. There we are. That's better.
It's absolutely shocking.
Oh, dear. Yeah, that is pretty bad, isn't it?
Yeah. So this is Fontainebleau.
Fontainebleau. He won't come home. Everyone's trying. His father-in-law tries to get him to come home. Luckily, a man called Sir George Prettyman takes hold of him and gets him away from Lord Ellen, gets him away from Savile. And they go and they visit Lyon and they visit Rome and they visit Venice. And at least he's not gambling, but he still won't come home.
Yeah.
And poor Martha tries to tell him to come home. And John the merchant, she writes, John tells me he would not come home unless I sent him a submissive letter, which I shall never do because I haven't done anything wrong. Eventually, he does come home only because the king orders it.
Oh, gosh.
It needed Charles II to have the order to get him home. He had to get home in 1685 because he was coming of age.
Yeah.
He was about to take over the Tredegar estates. So eventually they got him home, but it took ages.
Yeah.
Happily, Thomas and Martha do appear to have found some kind of, they had a son, and he actually says rather shamefaced years later, I'm as happy with my wife as any in the world. No man in England has a better home. How different in the 1690s. And so I shall conclude fearing that I have been too troublesome. Yes, I think you have.
Yeah. So he grew up.
And he's still moaning about the 1,500 a year he has to pay Elizabeth Dayrell. So much so, he didn't want to become Sheriff of Monmouthshire because it meant he had to pay money.
Oh, gosh. Was it?
Well,
that also shows how much available cash they've got left after this huge splurge of a build.
They're very rich. They're very wealthy.
But I think in hard cash terms, though, they virtually bankrupted themselves in building the house, didn't they? Because it is astonishingly lavish.
Yeah, and we think they couldn't afford to finish it, which is indicative in itself, right?
Oh, yeah. Because they must have the old idea of putting the money on the walls, they used to call it. They were no concept of nouveau riche, as we call it today. I mean, in terms of what's happening, this is Trump's gold apartment at the top of the tower block, you know?
I guess.
It's that ostentatious.
It is ostentatious. We think Thomas may have left his mark at Tredegar because although the carving up here suggests it was done by his father, William the Builder, the Roman heads really only come into fashion after 1680, after the builder's death. There is a chance that Thomas actually did these Roman heads.
Okay.
And you're on the verge of the Augustan age as well, where everything Roman becomes terribly fashionable.
Yeah, this is the brown room in Tredegar House.
It is indeed, with its splendid floor, 42 feet, single planks of oak. We've got a lot to say about this if we do an architecture podcast as well. So Thomas, actually, his only son, dies very young. Unfortunately, well, I'll say young. He's about 11 when he dies. Martha Mansell dies aged 26 in 1696, and Thomas dies in 1700, aged 36. So they didn't live very long. So what takes over is actually Thomas's brother. Had lots of kids, of course. William the Builder, and we have John Morgan, another John Morgan, who takes over here. And he marries into Breconshire, again getting even more Breconshire land with this splendid painting of his wife, Martha Vaughan, from Breconshire. And John and Martha do leave their mark on the Tredegar house, of course, we see today. John is seen as the great Whig. The Duke of Beaufort dies, and the new Duke is an infant, which means that power gap is just filled by the Morgans.
Yeah.
And the Morgans really take control of politics in Monmouthshire and Breconshire at this point. He's Lord Lieutenant of both Monmouthshire and Breconshire, and he has lined up all kinds of patronage. He is so wealthy that in his will, he leaves £22,000 just for his two daughters.
Blimey. And this is all from agricultural estate, isn't it? This is not any form of industrial or development at the moment. This is just an agricultural income.
It's agricultural. There is a forge in the park, but it's not making the money that the Industrial Revolution would bring. You're quite right. He builds the orangery at the back of the stable block.
With the stables.
It used to be said that with the hothouses and Tredegar and the orangery at Margam, you could heat the world. He also adds the rear stables, which we know as the groom's quarters. Yeah. Architecturally, again, are very interesting. And again, we'll talk about that on a later one. But the most obvious...
And again, you got to remember, they built orangeries because they were phenomenally expensive. They were, again, this is ostentatiously showing that you can afford to have an orangery. They weren't particularly gagging for oranges. But this is to show, look, we're so rich, we can have an orangery. This is we you can't underestimate the ostentation of this period in the display of the public display of wealth.
His ostentation was helped by the fact that John Morgan the merchant appeared quite a bit in this podcast, hasn't he?
Yes.
He died in 1715. So his Rupera Castle estate was passed on to John Morgan, his nephew. Yeah. He's inherited money. It's just growing. It's really growing. And with Rupera and all the money the merchant made as well, Royal African Company makes us think, dark thoughts about where that money came from.
The money is not terribly clean, shall we say.
No, the money passed to the Tredegars is not terribly clean.
No, the money that comes, John's input into it, I think. I don't think we should necessarily skate over this.
No.
The house crops up for this period in a list of slave ownership. That is not true. The family did not own slaves, but because of this association with the Africa Company, they were involved in something called the triangle trade, which is ships to Africa, slaves from Africa to America, goods home from America. And John, the merchant, his uncle, was one of the major investors in this.
He was a director.
And there are Morgan-owned ships, I believe, as well, that were involved in the trade. So, not owners, but they certainly benefited from the slave trade. And this is where the money comes in. This lump of slightly sticky, dirty money.
Yes, absolutely. And they did use the money from all kinds of sources. And John and Martha is, the Edney Gates is perhaps the most obvious. 1714 to 1718, and they created the Edney brothers of Bristol, William and Simon Edney, using the forge that was already on site. So they made the gates on site. Everything is locally produced, isn't it, at Tredegar?
Yeah.
I mean, the roads were so bad, it probably helped to get things locally produced. I mean, all of the wood for the house would have been local as well. The bricks we know are local.
You probably would have had to. You wouldn't have had these sort of mass production setups that we had. Everything was small scale. So if you got, an income and an estate of this size, you would have your own production units for this type of work.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what it was. It cost a pretty penny, but they look glorious. And you can see here at the top, you see JMM.
Yes,
John and Martha Morgan.
Yeah.
So there's cipher. There's acanthus leaves. This is just seen as foliage, but acanthus leaves are very Greek, showing rebirth. And so acanthus leaves are everywhere on the Edney Gates. So is this little face. Now, you're the man for this, Goff. Is this another one of these guardian things? What's that doing there?
Oh, interesting.
Is that another sprite that would be
I think it looks like a green man. It has elements of green man. There's foliage in the hat.
Way before Lady Raglan.
Yeah, either side of the mouth, it looks like there's indications maybe something growing out of the mouth, but it's not very clearly done. But definitely that crown piece, look, you've got leaves and foliage growing out of the side. How interesting. Yeah, and I think I'd say that's pretty much a green man figure.
Green man just above where you walk.
Well, do you know, I've locked that gate many, many times and not looked that closely to realise that, Or is it a sort of Bacchic figure? Because there were sort of grapes on there as well. Can you see the grapes at the top?
It's hard to tell. This is the closest best shot I could get of it.
Yeah, so it's either a green man figure or a sort of Bacchic figure like Bacchus or stuff. Or Pan even. There were horns. Can you see the horns?
Ooh,
there were horns either side. Oh, I think, that's really interesting, that figure. No, I take it back. I don't think it is a green man. I think it's something classical. It's a classical reference.
And
Yeah,
Okay. Well,
that's not a green man, but you've got foliage, horns, and grapes on it. I think you're probably looking at Bacchus or Pan.
I see. Well, John dies in 1720 or 1719 on the old calendar. And of course, they got lots of money. No one can spend all this money. Here comes his son. So William Morgan initially inherited Tredegar at the age of 19, which is a little bit like a teenager winning the lottery on double or triple rollover today, I would have thought.
Yeah.
And he does spend an awful lot of money, does Sir William Morgan. He spends £60 for a punch bowl. He's got his own French peruke maker, a wig maker. So he doesn't appear to be wearing a wig here, but he does have a peruke maker. He has 2 clarinetists he employs. He has his own harpist. I mean, he does extremely well for himself. And he's here. You can see him with the Order of the Bath. Now, he was made Order of the Bath in 1725, and for many years, from the cupola on top of the house, the little weathercock, and on it was a flag which said 1725, because 1725 was a very proud year for the Morgans of Tredegar. They are created a Knight of the Bath. And in those days, you would walk around dressed like this.
Oh, right, yeah.
Not just special occasions. You'd walk around with your red sash. You'd walk around with your bauble. Yeah. And of course, 1726 comes along. It's getting wintry. And Sir William Morgan has his bauble stolen near Reading.
Nothing worse than losing your baubles in the cold weather, is it?
The hive of villainy that is Reading. That's where it was stolen. How does he have all of this money? Because he marries... Well, he has lots of money anyway.
Yeah.
And in fact, his father was involved touching distance with... Or his grandfather was involved in touching distances with the Cavendishes. And he ends up marrying Lady Rachel Cavendish, the daughter of the 2nd Duke of Devonshire from, of course, Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, known as the Brown Beauty, apparently, because of her cascading locks. And so there he is. So he's got not only, she comes with £20,000, an enormous dowry, but it gets the Morgans into high wig society at the very, very top. Unfortunately for Sir William, when he had his Knight of the Bath stolen, he was made a mockery. This was written...
I love this, yes. Wonderful lampoon poem.
It is a lampoon. We now no longer think it was by Lord Chesterfield, but it was thought at the time that it was. Hear, all you friends to knighthood, a tale will raise your wonder, how caitiff vile, by basest wile, a hardy knight did plunder. Oh, had you seen our hero, no knight could e'er look bigger, and less his size my song belies than Morgan of Tredegar. A ribbon graced his shoulder, a star shone on his bresser, with smart toupee for bien poudre, and cockade on his cresser. The ribbon held a bauble, which his kind stars decreed him, with which he'd play both night and day. 'Twould do you good to see him. Though I a bauble call it, it must not thus be slighted. 'Twas one of the toys Bob gave his boys when first the chits were knighted. Learn hence, ye courtly lordlings, who hear this fatal story, on how slight strings depend those things whereon you hang your glory. The Bob's Boys thing is Sir Robert Walpole, who became what we see as the first Prime Minister. And he was furious at this lampoon because he was making fun of his patronage.
Oh, I see,
So Robert Walpole did indeed, it would seem, visit Tredegar after visiting Chatsworth. So he was the first Prime Minister to stay at Tredegar House, we believe. So,
cool.
Big circles. Big circles indeed.
Yeah, never knew that.
Yeah, now, Sir William had other things. Not only did he pay for a race course, a cockpit for Newport, he paid for a race course for Cardiff as well. Where is the race? The race course, we now know where the race course was. Any Cardiffians? We think Sir William's race course was where Greenmeadow Drive and Castle View at the north of Cardiff now is.
Oh, right.
Racetrack. That's what we think. So he made a pretty penny. He changed he had a personal coat of arms with his own motto. So no griffin and no stag's head as such. His motto, in fact, it was 2 huntsmen with these French horns. And his motto was, look before you leap.
Oh, right.
and as you can see, his French horns were still at Tredegar in the 20th century.
Oh, that little horned thing as well is still in the servants' hall.
It came back 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It came up at auction. Yeah, it was for the first Lord Tredegar when he came of age in 1813. Yeah. Now, a couple of things with this. Before we get on to this interesting servant at the back here. This is by John Wooten, this painting. A version of this painting is at Tredegar House to this day. William is at Newmarket. He's sort of aping his father-in-law, the Duke of Devonshire. It says 1723, I think, but that's either wrong or they've painted the Order of the Bath in afterwards.
Oh, that's
got in 1725. He married Lady Rachel in 1724, but 1723 was when they sorted out the marriage settlement and all that sort of thing, without getting too stuck into the weeds. And I love the names of his horses. Names of his horses. This is Lamprey. Race horses. Big on race horses. His horses included Beau, Cartouche. Young Cartouche was a very famous racehorse. Director, Elf, Frolic, Giant, Lamprey, and my favourite racehorse name of all time, Sir William Morgan's Slug.
Slug. Slug doesn't hold much hope, does he really? Yeah. He's hanging around in the back there. Yeah. And here comes Slug, 4 legs where the others. Yeah.
I'm not putting any money on Slug.
No.
But also we see here with this servant at the back.
Yeah.
Girolamo, or Girolamo the Black, as he appears in the letters and the papers. Girolamo Bardoletti, an Italian name.
Yes, Bardoletti.
It's interesting. We don't know that much about him. We do know his wages were £5 a year, which is a senior servant's wage.
Yeah.
I did see a scrap of paper at Aberystwyth which called him my master Girolamo, which is quite interesting. So he clearly was a senior servant.
Yeah.
He paid for his livery. We know in 1729 he travelled to Gloucestershire with the horses. So it does seem as if, again, he's here with the horses, isn't he?
Yes, yeah, he's got this sporting life connection, isn't he? And you can see quite clearly there. Because he wouldn't be in the picture otherwise, unless he's got this major association with William's racehorses and racing and horse breeding and what have you.
No, there is another a black servant on the books at the time, but worked in the house, which I expected was a footman called David the Black.
Yeah.
David seems a far more homegrown name, doesn't it?
Yes.
Whereas Girolamo Bardoletti, I mean, it's intriguing. I guess we probably will never find out his story. But we know he worked for 2 Morgans. He worked for Sir William Morgan and he worked for his son William the Younger as well.
Oh, right.
Right.
Oh, I didn't realise he worked for the older William. Oh, that's interesting.
Younger William.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
So I wish I had more information.
Right. So, interesting. So yeah. Well, you wonder with the Italian name whether he was someone that might have been sort of met and collected on a grand tour that they all did at some point.
Entirely possible. I mean, we know what Thomas was traveling all around Europe. Yeah.
So these connections are sort of made. We can think through parochially sometimes about these families. These were people again who spent a lot of time in continental Europe, and that's where you got your education, your classical education, your fashionable ideas of architecture. All these things flooded in as a result of the tour, and where they collect art pieces and influence and all sorts of things. So he's interesting. I remember talking to again. There's a prejudicial thing we look at when we look at these pictures of black people in service. When people will go, "Oh, was he a slave?" And that was no. Girolamo was never a slave. Girolamo is Master Girolamo. He's paid. We're making a prejudice based on the color of the individual to see that his position is somehow within that regard. Slavery had not been outlawed by this point, but they would not. He was definitely not in that position.
Don't generally pay slaves £5 a year, do you?
No, you don't. No, he's far too important for that. Yeah, interesting, fascinating. One of the I remember having a conversation with one of the experts, the slavery creators from Bristol Museum, where obviously it's a very big thing, and she was saying, no, the fact that he has this very clear, different name, this independent, this very clear name, that is also an indication that he wasn't enslaved at any point either.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, Sir William doesn't live again very long. He dies at the age of 30 of a consumption.
Yeah.
Again, could mean almost anything today, couldn't it? We think of
Yeah.
TB, but it's sort of an umbrella term. Dead at 30, didn't live really long enough to enjoy this wealth, although he got through a lot of it. He spent so much money that all you have to do was wait 10 years and the estate was £21,000 in debt. Which, when you think of the wealth he inherited, is some going, isn't it?
Yeah. But when you think he had to be talked out of shoeing his horses in gold for his investiture.
Oh, he wasn't talked out. He shod them in silver.
Oh, silver. Oh, my.
Oh, he did it. He wasn't talked out of it. Oh, no.
Oh, I thought he was talked out of the gold and he went for the silver second.
Oh, maybe he did. Maybe it makes sense. And his son, William Morgan the Younger, is a rather sad individual. He was MP as well. He lived to the age of 38. He dies in 1763. But what we know about William the Younger is not particularly good. He seems quite a sad character. We know he's interested in music. There's a patronage to him. We know the estate is run appallingly during his time. Absolutely appallingly. And we know that he died very sadly. A diary of William Thomas, a contemporary diary of the time, says, died this morning at his house at Tredegar, William Morgan, from lingering dropsy and gout, from overmuch drinking and keeping himself from order all these years. He abused himself by drinking and watching.
Oh.
Watching's back.
The word watching again, yeah.
Yeah, so William the Younger sort of is, but it's awfully run. The estate. It is terribly run in this period. I know it's challenging, but there was one chap who had not paid rent for 18 years. The property near St. Woolis Cathedral. There are extenuating circumstances, but nevertheless, it's appalling. Yeah. The estate is badly run. William the Younger's sister, Elizabeth Morgan, final remaining daughter of Lady Rachel and Sir William Morgan, does try and help her brother and is essentially mistress of the house for 13 years. Very important figure in the house's history. But swimming against the tide, I'm afraid. And here we see the house from the late 18th century with the cupola still there.
Yeah.
Now, when William the Younger dies in 1763, it is time for his uncle, Sir William's brother, General Thomas Morgan of Rupera, to take over. That's what the will says. This is General Thomas was, you could see, the studious brother, whether Sir William's paying money for the racehorses. General Thomas is having a legal career, which was very successful. It ended up with him being Judge Advocate General of His Majesty's forces, in charge of all the court martials and the legal side of the British Army of the day. There he is, looks quite jolly, doesn't he?
Yeah, I don't think I've actually ever seen that picture of him.
No, it's not at Tredegar House. This came from an auction.
Oh, gosh.
Who knows where he is now? Yeah. But this is General because Judge Advocate General rather than any military service. So he thinks he's going to take over quite easily. Unfortunately, his niece Elizabeth, by now Elizabeth Jones of Clither, has other thoughts. Her and her mother, Lady Rachel, think, well, actually, surely my father meant me to inherit the estate. And she asked General Thomas to have a dig around at Tredegar to look for documents which proves her case. I'm sure he didn't look very hard.
Right, yes.
Before handing over Tredegar, Elizabeth had about a month, I think, of Tredegar to herself. Foolish by General Thomas.
Yeah.
Basically changed the locks on the study and took any document that might help in a future legal case with her to Clither. General Thomas was far too trusting.
I love her. I think she's wonderful.
Because Elizabeth Jones's mum, Lady Rachel Cavendish, there she is, with her adoring sheep.
Adoring, yeah.
She was made of tough stuff as well, wasn't she, Goff?
Oh, yes. Yeah, oh, yeah. She was not going to stand by and take it easily, was she? She was obviously a daughter of the Devonshires. She was going to get what was owed her. She was entitled for £2,000 a year for life under her marriage settlement. Yeah. And she was going to make sure she got it. Eventually, things had lapsed very, very badly because her son wasn't paying it, William, who was, abusing himself chiefly and watching in the night hours.
Don't forget the watching.
Don't forget the watching. He wasn't paying her. So when he died, she was owed something like 5,000, and the entire estate was only worth about 3 at the time. So she was owed more than the value of the estate. So she sued them basically. She went to the courts of Chancery in London to try and overturn her son's will, so that the property would go to her daughter. Her daughters would go to Wonderful Elizabeth.
She's great, isn't she?
Elizabeth of Jones of Clither. So she's kicked off this notorious Chancery court case that ran for 19 years.
In total, yeah. What actually happened initially, Elizabeth and her husband, William Jones, who was Catholic. So it's very hard for Catholics with every big major property deal had to be countersigned by a Protestant. And William Jones probably thought, this is a chance to get to the top table here.
Yeah.
My wife inherits Tredegar. I'm there, you know?
Yeah.
So William was all for it. Elizabeth was all for it. And they go for the entire estate.
Yeah.
But in 1774, it was decided that they lost that initial case for the whole estate. So what they then did with Lady Rachel was get for the back payment maintenance.
Yeah.
The dowry. She didn't care about the jointure when her son was alive, William the Younger, but when he died, she wanted back payments. And it was, as you said, 19 years all in all.
Yeah.
Very, very messy.
You could understand Elizabeth's point of view. I mean, when you've essentially been mistress of the house for 13 years, and your son, and William, her brother, never married, had no heirs. So you could understand her grievance of all this after she's attempted to maintain this poorly run estate for such a long time, just being passed over to her uncle. You see, no wonder she's aggrieved about it.
Oh, quite right.
So I think she was perfectly right to, try and get as much as she could, frankly.
Yeah. There is a story that at one point, a mini victory in 1774, when they lost the estate, they were awarded everything in Tredegar House, all the personal possessions of Sir William. And it was said that Lady Rachel basically took everything and left bare boards for General Thomas, put it in a barn in Basleg, and a lot of it was ruined because of rainwater that got in the barn.
Oh, yeah. It's an absolute Pyrrhic victory, isn't it? Because the Morgans haven't invested in the house for 20 years in case they lost it. So the house, they get this empty house that's in a very poor state of repair. Elizabeth and they get all the furniture, which instantly gets rotted by damp in a building. And it took them 19 years to reach that ridiculously pointless end of it all, Yeah.
But I do love the sheer cheek of Elizabeth, because not all of the furniture was in that barn, clearly.
Oh, right,
because including 6 Wootton paintings of horses, including the one presumably which is on the walls of the Brown Room today, because some must have still been there, because she very kindly offered to sell it to her uncle.
Oh, there's a lovely table that would just suit that room.
It's there now. Pay me for it. Yeah, and now, Goff, do explain, because eventually they did lose the case, as we know, at Chancery. There they all are. Very jaundice v. jaundice. What was Rachel's reaction? Was it equanimity? Was it mild acceptance?
No. They, like all great families, you have to labor under a curse. And it was said that
the Morgan...
Oh, yeah, it is. It's a rule. You have to be cursed by somebody. You have to set fire to a witch, and then damn you, and all your noses get fat or something like this. But no, Elizabeth is alleged to have cursed the lot of them, and said that no son of Thomas Morgan's would ever bear an heir. And then, sure enough, it came to pass, because the 3 sons of Thomas, Thomas, Charles, and John, all inherited, and all of them died without the issue and heirs.
So don't mess with the Duke's daughter.
No, pay up. That's the main thing, isn't it? Pay up.
Well, let's go through that then to finish off. We've got the Chancery. By the way, that's the most simplified version of the Chancery case me and you have done I've ever seen. So well done, Goff. Pat yourself on the back. We've got out of Chancery.
Yeah.
Dear Elizabeth, still, do you know what? As I learn more, she's becoming my favourite female Morgan,
Yeah. So
I think she's beating out Lois Sturt now.
Shame we missed out on her portrait, wasn't it? Because it came up for sale a couple of years ago and it wasn't purchased. That's a pity.
It's in America, I think, now. American who bought her on eBay. She should be back at Tredegar.
On eBay? She was bought on eBay?
She cropped up on eBay.
Oh, what a shame.
Go on, send her back. Go on. It'll be good for your soul, wouldn't it?
Yeah. We'll love you. We'll talk about you forever and say how marvellous you are.
Anyway, she died in 1787, so she didn't actually see the end of the case.
Oh, gosh.
And her husband was heartbroken. Why wouldn't you be? She's fantastic, Elizabeth Jones. And so he built this Clither Castle, which is basically a memorial to the loss of a perfect wife.
Yeah.
It's romantic.
Yes.
If you want to know what happens next to the Jones family, do click on our Clither Park and Clither Castle podcast, because the story continues there, doesn't it, Goff?
Yes, it does.
Now, he would have mocked, we're back to General Thomas, he would have mocked the curse. How ridiculous, as you said, he has these 3 strapping sons. Don't seem to be too keen to marry, actually, but I'm sure that will be fine. General Thomas does a lot to Tredegar House because he has to basically fix it after it's been let to go to rack and ruin by William the Younger. He spends a lot of money. Most of the picture frames at Tredegar House that are very similar, you know the kind?
Yes.
Are from him. He rehangs the paintings, reframes a lot of them in 1766. He pays for the clock, which is on the stable block.
Oh, interesting.
Has to pay a fortune because this thing has been, battered and mothballed, dear old Tredegar, during the uncertainty of the great event of the Chancery case.
Yeah.
His eldest son, Colonel Thomas, dies at the age of 44 of liver failure, liver damage in 1771. He doesn't marry, as you said, but there are rumours, which we can say here. There's a letter someone wrote to Tredegar House that they believed that they knew in the 1980s that Colonel Thomas Morgan had married a Catholic.
Oh.
And his 2 brothers agreed that he could take over Tredegar House, but on his death, everything would go to the brothers, not the children from this Catholic marriage. And he's airbrushed the wife out of history.
Yes, I have heard that. Yes, I have.
Yeah, but it's just a rumour. I wouldn't say it anywhere else but here.
Oh, so it is solely a rumour then? There isn't any.
It's a rumour, but there's no evidence of it. But when I was at Aberystwyth, seconded there, someone had clearly heard that I'd been working on the Tredegars and wrote a letter from London. They're now a solicitor saying, my ancestor, I don't know if you know this, my ancestor was Colonel Thomas Morgan, who married a Roman Catholic.
Oh, well.
I'm descended from him. So again, I wouldn't put it into print, but we talk about all kinds of rumours on the podcast. So maybe.
Interesting.
Anyway, it doesn't count, though, because they were airbrushed. So he dies in 1771.
Isn't that a shame? And it means there might be legitimate heirs of the Morgan still floating around out there.
It's their loss.
Yeah.
It passed on to Charles Morgan. And Charles Morgan, Charles and his brother John had a great relationship. They were basically co-hosts at Rupera, co-hosts at Tredegar. They got on so well that Catherine Van, who was his sister, their sister, had a grandson called Charles John.
Oh, okay.
Charles John with a hyphen.
Yeah,
because these two are inseparable brothers.
Yeah.
Charles married Mary Miners, and he dies childless, as you say, in 1787, leaving the unmarried John.
Oh, right.
Hadn't married. John marries pretty much to get an heir because he's the last one.
Well, yeah, I mean, and if you think in the course of things, he wouldn't even be, he was, the spare for the spare, wasn't he?
Good point.
Yeah, the fact that 3 of them all the other 2 brothers predecease him without heir, he would not in the normal course of events been expected to be in this position. No.
He's a very cultured man, John. He collected Roman coins. He was something of an antiquarian, something of an historian. His books, his payment books, have survived over the years, and as a younger man, they're very interesting. He pays 2 and 6 for Mending My Instrument case, so he plays music as well.
Oh, yeah.
He slightly ruins it by paying 6pence by going to Lord Ferrers's execution.
Good day out for all the family.
He pays 2 shillings for seeing the elephants and zebras. Don't know where he saw elephants and zebras.
Yeah.
And he also pays money to take the Goulds to see the waxworks.
Oh,
Sister Jane and her husband Charles.
Oh, that's interesting.
But you can tell when he does marry, he marries the daughter of Charles Pym Burt and the niece of the governor of the Leeward Islands. And this is where slavery comes in again, because
more
the
messy money.
The Burts certainly had plantations. So any money that would have trickled in through Louisa, through her dowry, would have come to the Morgans via slavery. There's no getting away from that fact.
No.
It's not very sentimental either, because her dad, Louisa's dad, writes to John saying, it will be particularly agreeable to her to avoid all the unnecessary ceremonies of courtship. But she knows she's going to give her hand to a man of the greatest merit. No, that's romantic nonsense. It's a business deal. Get on with it.
Well, I never.
That's essentially what he's saying.
Yeah.
And anyway, John does get on with it. Marries her in 1788, vastly older than Louisa.
Yeah.
But it's purely, and she becomes pregnant several times, but loses the baby each time.
Yeah, it's
It's
very sad, isn't it? It's very sad, this.
It is extremely sad. John has got all sorts on his mind as well. His Rupera Castle burnt down in 1783.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I forgot about that.
But there's no better man to rebuild it than the cultured man that John is. So John rebuilds it. He starts rebuilding it in 1785, and he turns it into this very familiar sight for a lot of us in this part of the world. But yeah, so this carries on. It's very sad with all of these lost children, and quite frankly, he's starting to feel very ill. By the time we get to 1791, someone in their diary spots John Morgan at an event and says that he was clutching his head in agony.
Oh, gosh.
Don't know what's going on there in 1791. He's clearly very ill. Fortunately, Louisa does become pregnant in 1791. And indeed, she gives birth to the joy of Tredegar. She gives birth to a child, and indeed that child is male. The line is saved, but the child lives for half an hour.
Yeah, I know. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? That
John dies the next year, 1792. And he's not quite the end of the Morgans, because, you know, when he dies, Louisa's pregnant again.
Oh, God.
There's this delay. The Morgans dead and gone. So if she gives birth to a boy, then the Morgans live on.
Yeah.
He dies not knowing whether his line will live on.
Yeah.
Although he has a backup plan, which we'll talk about in part 2. In part 3, sorry.
Part 3, yeah.
Yeah, he dies, and there is much wailing. There's a huge funeral at Lower Macon Church, Michael and All Angels, where a lot of the people we've talked about here today are buried. Do visit that church if you get the chance, and just look at the memorial.
Yeah.
We have a weeping angel.
Yeah.
And it's weeping not for a man, it's weeping for a dynasty.
Yeah.
There we are for Charles and his brother John.
Yeah.
Next to each other, quite rightly, because they were as close as brothers can be.
Yeah.
And indeed, someone writes a little poem about this and says, Tredegar, mourn nor wear a cheerful smile. Let sorrow reign within thy walls a while. He's gone, the last of Morgan's train, forever gone, not to return again.
Blimey.
No way out of it. The Morgans have died out in 1792.
So what happened with the last child that was still in utero when he died?
I'm afraid Louisa had another miscarriage.
Oh, gosh.
She married again, a Mr. Smith, where she had more miscarriages.
Oh, gosh.
I just wish there'd been a portrait of Louise Burt or Louise Morgan or Louisa Smith, because she must have gone through hell. Can you imagine the pressure?
Oh, can't you?
Knowing you've married a man to give birth, and not just give birth, but to keep a dynasty alive as ancient as the Morgans of Tredegar. Must have gone through hell.
Yeah, terrible.
However, so the Morgans are done. However, this poem at the funeral does suggest there might still be some kind of hope. Oh dear, I'm gone. Why am I gone? You can't see me, can you?
No, you're invisible. Oh my goodness. Keep talking, you're still there.
Well, I'm still here, even though you can't see me. Some might. Oh, yay! Here I am.
Hey, he has returned.
It's me ruining the death of a dynasty by disappearing and coming back again. At the same funeral, there is hope, for they say, Glamorgan, Monmouth, Brecon, don't despair. God ever lives and reigneth everywhere. No hardships fear, for Gould shall still maintain our lawful rights, pleasure, peace, and gain. I don't know how we managed to cram the 17th and 18th century into this time period. God.
It's a lot, isn't it? It's a hell of a lot, isn't it? It's a lovely, I think it's a fascinating period, and they're fascinating people. And it's a complex history, and it's got all sorts of like wonderfully chewy issues to get your teeth into, but they don't feature quite as much now in the actual presence of the house as such. Now there's only it's only the gilt and gold rooms in which you see them now. But it's quite there. I think they're a lovely, fascinating history of this period of the house. And again, it's the end of the direct male line of the Morgans all over.
all over. So how do they get out of this one? Well, we will we'll talk about it in part 3, which should be the 19th and 20th century.
Possibly, we have to
Maybe
see.
the
I mean,
19th.
there's such a lot in both of them. So we may, what we planned as a trilogy may become a quartet.
I think that's fair enough.
We'll have to see how it goes.
I think that's fair. I love the fact, I don't know if we mentioned it, but I love the sheer stubbornness of the 18th century Morgans. Lady Rachel,
Yeah.
knowing that there's £2,000 a year the Morgans had to pay her for the rest of her life. When her husband dies at 30, she stubbornly goes on living for another 49 years. I don't think we mentioned that.
Yes,
She dies in 1780.
Oh, yeah, in her 80s. Oh, yeah, I think also this is a fascinating period because it has some of the strongest female characters in the family as well. I mean, the 18th century women are forces in their own right. A lot of the 19th century ladies tend to take a back seat a lot more.
Society changes at that point, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In the 18th...
yeah, I think, it's a very different world we're going to go into in the next episode.
So let's say it's 19th, let's not kid ourselves, it's going to be the 19th century. Yeah. What can people, do a little tease, what can people expect from our 19th?
This is the transition, this is the rise of the Morgans from an agricultural estate, which is very rich, to an industrial and commercial estate, which becomes fantastically rich. And the roots are laid by the man that inherits this title, and his family then carry it right the way through the 19th century, up until virtually before the outbreak of the First World War. So this is where the Morgans are really at their maximum influence, their maximum income, and their maximum position within society when they finally become the Lords Tredegar.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. You know, I didn't mention that both John Morgan, who did the gates, and Sir William Morgan with the racehorses, both of them were linked in the press, such as it was, with having peerages.
Yeah.
In fact, but it wasn't going to be Lord Tredegar, it was going to be Earl of Brecknock.
Yeah.
On both indications. But they didn't get it, did they?
They died before they could get it. They died too young. Yeah. When William dies in 1724, it takes them literally 120 odd years to get back in a position of getting into becoming ennobled. But this is basically 19th century is the ennoblement of the Morgans and rise as a political force as well, because all the chickens are coming back, and everything is doing extremely everything is firing for the Morgans at this point. Interesting.
Well, thank you, Goff. And
a pleasure as always.
Thank you all for watching, and we do appreciate it. And hopefully, I'm not sure when, but there will be, I hope, part 3 of the Tredegar saga, where, as Goff says, we head full steam into the 19th century. Thank you, and I hope you join us again. Goodbye.
Bye.